My day job is I run the Lustre team at Intel, but I'm speaking right now in my capacity as one of the leads of the Lustre working group. And so thanks to Sarp for his hard sell on participation in that group. So this group has existed in various incarnations for about 7 years now, since basically things moved out, the Lustre team moved out from Oracle, and we had more diversity where people were based and who was engaged in Lustre development. It's basically a central forum where we can coordinate on all activities relating to the Lustre releases. So there's definitely a number of people here who are regular participants in those meetings. They are bi-weekly, not weekly, Sarp, but the details are on the wiki page there. I appreciate it's not practical for everyone to attend even like a bi-weekly meeting, and particularly if you're in Asia or Europe, the time zone, the times of the meeting are not necessarily convenient. But we do, have a mailing list, and there are minutes posted to try and, help, allow people to stay in touch with what's going on and have different ways of providing input. So one of the things that we're involved in is the community survey. So you've probably seen this go out on the mailing list sort of February, March every year. We've been doing this for 7 years now, believe it or not. And this is a really interesting way of getting a read on how people are using Lustre out in the community, and what people would like to be doing with Lustre. Of course, the OpenSFS requirements gathering is a much more detailed, deep dive into looking ahead, but this survey aims to be a very sort of simple, light way of just getting a quick read across a broader cross-section, because it's not limited to OpenSFS members, and it's at least half the participants pretty regularly are not working with a vendor of any kind, and are just using Lustre as open source software. So I'm really delighted this year. We had over 50% uptake on the number of respondents this year compared to last year. It's the highest ever year in terms of number of people who completed the survey. So just to reiterate, this is, it's an anonymous survey. It takes, a few minutes to complete, and there's no danger of you being inundated with spam if you do take the time to fill it out. So just to give and I do have the detailed results of this year and all the other years are on this link here on the OpenSFS wiki. But I've just picked out some of the highlights just to spotlight here today. So this, I think, is very interesting. This is the versions. So on this one, we've got, hopefully you can see that, but the blue bar is the 2017 numbers, and the red is the 2018 numbers. So I put those side by side so you can sort of see the trends as they're shaping up. So broadly, in most cases, you see the older releases, the numbers, the percentage, these are percentage numbers as well. So even though you've got different respondents, there's you can make some kind of comparison. You can see the trend is, generally that the numbers of the older releases, the percentages of people running them are slightly lower, this year compared to last year, as you'd expect. Systems running older versions have been taken out of service or have been upgraded. And of course, the big thing is, since last year's survey, the 2.10 release and the maintenance releases associated with that have come out. And so, what's really quite amazing, I was hopeful that we'd see a strong uptake in 2.10, but the time this survey was conducted was just over 6 months from the initial, .0 GA version of 2.10, and it came in exactly neck and neck with 2.5 at the highest level. So I think that's really, shows that there's really strong demand for those LTS releases. So I'm really delighted that we're doing those, that that kind of thing is available again, and it's a really positive thing for me as well that we do see with the newer releases as well, even 2.9 still is holding quite strong of people running that in production. And of course, people may have multiple versions in production, so that's why the numbers are higher. But I think that as well is the fact that people, with 2.9 was a release that came out and didn't have any maintenance releases associated with that, and still, despite the 2.10 releases being available, people are using it in fairly high numbers still in production. And so I think this is a real testimony to our quality practices, and we've made changes in recent years where we segregated larger features, and they are in their own, essentially a sandbox, and they're tested and reviewed and everything there. And then when it's felt that it's at the point where it's completely ready to integrate in the release, only then is it integrated. In the past, we used to bleed the features in, and maybe things would, take longer to get out because, we knew that there was some instabilities or things weren't completely ready. So, moving on. So Linux distributions, this is really, there's not a huge change here from last year. These are just this year's numbers. The red is the clients, and the blue is the servers. And you can see that Red Hat is showing up in this survey very consistently as being Red Hat and derivatives. So CentOS, Scientific Linux as well, as being most widely used. The only change here, really, from the last years is that Red Hat 7 has finally overhauled Red Hat 6 as the most commonly used. Networks, again, type of networks being used. There's quite a bit of diversity here. Mellanox and 10GigE seem to be the most common options. This is pretty similar to previous year's data. And then feature usage. So this is different to the requirements gathering that OpenSFS does. This is looking at features that are available today in releases that are generally available, and just to see how much people are using them. Just because there is an option there doesn't mean all those things are being fully utilized. So I think the most interesting thing here is that, and the blue is using in production today, and the red is planned to use within a year. So, you can see as things are people have intentions to go but not using them yet, to get a sense of the demand for a certain feature. So you can see, with ZFS and LFSCK, those are in releases people are using and are being widely used. But then, on the other hand, D&E, which has been out for a couple of years now, it is relatively still, for the Stripe directories, which came out in 2.8, it is relatively no numbers of people using that in production still. And even with the people who did complete, they were using it. I mean, this isn't an iterative process, because it's anonymous, it's detached. I have no way of talking to the people who've completed this survey. Some of the, looking at the answers from respondents who did say they were using D&E Stripe directories, maybe it was unclear because some of the versions and stuff that were supplied don't seem quite consistent with that response. So, but nevertheless, it's pretty evident, and I think we saw the same at the BOF at SC as well, to suggest that people haven't been adopting that yet. And the other thing I think to highlight here is that data on MDT, which just came out in 2.11, and project quotas, which came out in 2.10. Both of those have very strong numbers of people who are not using it yet, but expect to be doing so in the coming year. So the usage, this was something we sort of changed around a bit, refined since last year. So we'd always had a question which was just fairly coarse-grained. Are you research, or are you in enterprise? It was just that kind of coarse-grained. And so this year we've sort of asked people to characterize their primary usage of Lustre. So again, people can select multiple options. So you could say, if you're an academic in doing research in life sciences, you could have checked, both boxes of education and genomics life sciences. So here, things that were a surprise were, I knew that genomics life sciences, was widely used, but to the degree that the respondents came back on the survey, I was surprised by that. That was, in excess of, some other categories I thought would come out higher. And then AI machine learning it was again, I knew that there was things going on out there, but I didn't realize it was to this degree. And then finally, the other category is way too big. Obviously, we need to look at some of these answers and make sure we have, more categories to capture some of these groups, because there was commonality in those areas. I think particle physics came out, just jumps in my mind, but I think there were a couple that were in that category. So moving on to the LTS releases. So we had the GA came out shortly after LUG last year, last July. We've had a few maintenance releases already. As you can see, that's been well adopted out in the community. And we're at the moment working on a 2.10.4 release, which will add support for Red Hat 7.5. That will come out in the coming weeks. And the other question I always get asked in this area, and I'm sure Dustin gets this too, is what will be the next LTS release? So we don't know that yet for sure. We'll probably decide later in the year in the LWG based on when we have a bit more information. I think it's a bit premature to make that decision yet. We definitely want to make sure that we have, we're targeting a release that has feature content that people are going to be really able to, most people will be happy to get behind. So, that's, watch this space basically, and hopefully we'll be able to give some more firm guidance by, SC to say, the timing of the switch and what the next target release will be so people can prepare, appropriately. So the 2.11 release came out just a few weeks ago. So, a lot of work goes into these releases over many months. And so yet to hear much feedback from people using that yet. So if anyone has had a chance to even just test that out or, even better, is running in production on that already, definitely like to chat to you. I obviously get to hear feedback from the LWG of people who have been testing, but, it's good to hear, some more diverse opinions. So, yeah, please come and introduce yourself on a break if you've got something to say there. In terms of feature content, so probably the standout features here is data on MDT is definitely, is to help with small file I/O, and we have a couple of talks on this later on the agenda. I think Joe Gmitter is presenting, I think, tomorrow about small file I/O, and this data on MDT will be a large part of that, and I believe DDN have a talk about their experiences with this feature on Thursday. So I think that's, having two talks, I think, is indicative of the level of interest in this feature, and it's definitely one that has consistently come up when we've sort of polled people about, new features they'd like to see for a long time. So it's great to finally get that out. And also file level redundancy. The initial framework is here, and I think Andreas will talk a bit more about where we go next with this feature, but basically, this is the initial groundwork, and then, that will be built on. Lock ahead is a performance improvement that can be used for a single shared file. The Lustre audit with change logs, that's Sébastien Buisson of DDN presented about this work and the rationale behind it at LAD last year, so you can definitely dig out that if you're interested in finding out a bit more about that work and why that was introduced. And Andreas will talk a bit more about OI Scrub for ZFS in his ZFS specific talk, which I think is tomorrow, sometime. Looking at the contribution stats for 2.11. So these are just two views on the same data. This one is the number of commits. This one is the amount, the lines of code changes that went in. So the things that, always sort of jump out to people is this discrepancy here with, Oak Ridge contribution, and this is, Oak Ridge's one-man coding machine, James Simmons, the work he does with the upstream client. There's lots of, huge amounts of code being changed and reformatted, and so that's why, he has a lot of, changes that touch a lot of lines of code. So that's why that, the percentage-wise, that looks a bit bigger there. But, you generally see a lot of the usual suspects. So I do want to call out, it's good to see, SUSE have been back getting involved again in this release, so that's a really positive thing, really welcome that. And just seeing some people for the first time showing up here. So NEC have a change, and Sandia as well. So Ruth there did that, made a change, I believe, at the hackathon at LUG last year. So that's great. That finally came out, landed in the 2.11 release. And then Uber as well, who, it's great to see, Uber getting involved in the Lustre community. And I believe they have a talk on Thursday about what they're up to with Lustre. So moving on to reviews. So the reviews are a key part of our quality practice, and You can see, again, a lot of people involved here. So I'd like to, call out Stefan again. I know he's already had his standing up thing for today, but Stefan is at TL is at Stanford, and he had a couple of reviews that he did in the 210 cycle, and he was up to 11 reviews, in areas that they're interested in for the 211 cycle. So, really good to see people getting involved in the releases, in any way they're able to. Oh, sorry, wrong way. So in seeing how 211 fits, in comparison to other releases, so 211's down here. So you see in terms of the number of changes and the lines of code changed, it's fairly similar in size to 2.6. And then the number of actual engineers involved, or developers who've had changes included, fairly similar to 210. The number of organizations has gone up this year with, we tend to have a hardcore of regulars and then a number of people who have, smaller numbers of contributions who, can affect the numbers. So we had, there's been some rationalization between vendors, which maybe has a downward shift on these overall number of organizations, but then, on the positive uptick, there's been a number of, smaller players involved, which overall has had an upward shift. And just, to say as well, this excludes, there is a much greater diversity than that we just exclude, from changes that come through from the upstream kernel folk, because this is just people who are actually, coming through the front door, as so to speak, in terms of, contributing directly to Lustre rather than, pushing a change in the staging area of the kernel as part of, some other effort. So these are people who are directly involved in Lustre development. Moving on to 2.12, so we've just got underway here, pretty early days. So we're shaping up. Right now, we're targeting that we'll have, Red Hat 7.5 servers and clients. We've gone for SLES 12 SP3 clients. So with SUSE, it was a bit unclear whether we would go with, the latest SLES 12 versus, the latest SLES 15. So at the moment, we thought it would be most useful to people to go with a SLES 12, and that would be what people be most likely to use in a production situation. But if you want to come and tell me that I'm totally, we're totally wrong and we should be using SLES 15, I'd definitely like to hear about why. And then Ubuntu 18.04, Ubuntu's definitely been getting a lot more interest in recent years. It's using a lot more cutting edge kernels. So this 18.04 release, I believe, is due out at the end of this month. So it will have had, we've got plenty of time in the 2.12 cycle for release coming out in October to work with that. And I believe it's based on the 4.15 kernel, so that should definitely, work for people who are very interested in, staying, fairly close to the cutting edge there. In terms of the features that are here, the D&E directory restriping, that gives you the ability to migrate an existing directory to a Stripe directory. And LNet Network Health, Amir, I believe, has a presentation about that maybe tomorrow, about the work going on there. And DDN has a presentation about their work on the lazy science on MBDT, I think, well, I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly when, but definitely over the conference, so I'll defer to them to cover that in more detail. So we've refreshed the LWG, we refreshed the format of the roadmap, and so the feeling was, with the introduction of the LTS releases, it would be good to show that and, the releases coming out in a clearer format. So, I think overall people really like this different approach and feel that it's more cleaner than the old one. But, again, interested to hear different points of view if you feel there's something we could do to improve things. And also to highlight as well, the graphical roadmap tends to just have more give a directional high-level view of like when the releases are expected and just maybe a couple of highlights of what's expected to be in those releases. And we do try and keep the projects page on the wiki more up to date with all the individual things. So if you're interested in, if you're thinking, where's this? I thought this certain feature was coming. I don't see it on the roadmap. This is going to be your first port of call to try and, track down. And it should have contact details of whom to, connect with if you're wanting to get more involved in that. So, and I always try and give a plug for documentation. So, I know the Lustre Operations Manual is a long-standing figure of fun, and but it, if anyone is using Lustre, if the documentation is either inaccurate or incomplete, and if you know that, if you at least open a ticket to draw attention to that, it gives us the opportunity to try and fix it. I mean, ideally would be to tell us the right answer and push a change to make the correction. But if we actually have it recorded, that hey, this section isn't correct or it needs some changing or elaboration, then we can, somebody else can pick that up and maybe save someone else some future pain. So to summarize, we've had a really productive year in terms of what we've got done with advancing the roadmap. If you think since LUG last year, we've now had the 2.10 and the 2.11 releases GA. So if you think about some of the features in there, there have been some really long-term things that people have wanted in Lustre. LNet multi-rail, project quotas, data on MGT, file level redundancy. These are all things that people have for a long time said, oh, why doesn't Lustre have this? So that's been really positive, and we've had a lot of, clearly the LTS releases have been, really well adopted out there. That just based on the survey results, and 2.10.4 should be coming out soon with support for Rails 7.5, and again, continuing as we get, more and more feedback from the field about, various edge cases that people have run into. And we have fixed those up, so that would be that's the goal with these releases, right? Is that they should be the best known version, right? That if you're looking to have predictable, stable running, that should be the release you're choosing, the latest 2.10x. And there's always plenty of options for those who are interested in contributing to Lustre, from as Sarp pointed out his thing, from just providing input to helping get the wiki information up to date if there's some instructions that are stale, right the way through to actually developing code. So that's what I have here. Does anyone have any questions right now, or someone at the back there? Hi.
Thanks, Peter. I guess my question was, what's the progression of the LTS branch? Is that going to jump to 14, 2.15? Or will some of these, the exciting features like data and MDT be backported to, the 2.10 LTS?
So we wouldn't backport, huge features into an LTS release. I mean, that would kind of undermine the reason for having them. I know there's a lot of people interested in that feature in particular. So, it's still possible if we're having a lot of, demand from people who are using 2.11 in production, and we're finding there are some bugs that are impairing their ability to do that, we could still issue a 2.11.1 release. But until 2.12 comes out, and then we'll just say, look, use 2.12, right? Because that will have all the bug fixes in there as well. And there is some, further usability work relating to data on MDT that's going into 2.12 that Andreas will talk a bit more about later on. Or actually, maybe Joe is going to talk about that in his small file I/O talk tomorrow. But we haven't decided yet which release we'll switch over for. We'll look to take input, but I think definitely what people will look for is there'll be several candidates of releases we could look at, which will affect the timing, and it will really depend where features are going to fall. Like what we saw before is, back in the day, we had 2.4 be announced as a maintenance release stream, and then as it, and that was projected based on expected what features were going to be in 2.4, and as it happened, the last 10% of HSM only made it in 2.5, and then so we had a couple of releases on 2.4, and then we switched to 2.5, because there was strong pressure that people wanted to have 2.5 with HSM be the one getting maintenance updates. And then that was, disruptive to people who had already moved forward with 2.4 with the expectation that would be an ongoing release. So I think, we'll aim to make a statement about that by supercomputing But we've definitely committed that 2.10 will remain the LTS release at least through 2018, and maybe longer. I mean, if people are happy with that and would rather hold on for the next big thing, we'll wait, right? So that's a long answer for we don't know yet.
Other questions for Peter?
Have you got a more detailed breakdown on the OS usage? Reason for asking is when I've had discussions with the likes of Red Hat, they have been quite adamant that over their cold, dead fingers will they have any form of Lustre support / usage. CentOS, I understand, is a completely different ballgame. But having real figures to be able to go back to them to try and negotiate a little bit more than the brick wall that you get.
So I hear mixed feedback in that area. Of course, I can't speak on behalf of Red Hat. I can just say this is the survey data, this is what people told us. There was no differentiation. All those people may be using CentOS. Why don't we chat at a break? Okay. Anything else, or if anyone's shy, I'm happy to chat on breaks as well. Okay, I think it's James up next, right?
Our next presenter is